On the windy, dark night of December 8, 1894, at 147 Parsons Avenue, Columbus, Ohio, James Grover Thurber, second of the three sons of Charles Thurber and Mary Fisher, was born. James was named by his grandfather, who decided to pass on the name of one of his best friends. So James, or Jamie, the thin, cute, and fragile son of an actress and a wannabe actor who worked as a clerk, came into the world without much fanfare into a little house on Parsons Avenue, a gift from Mary's father. James always said that he was much too young at the time of his birth to have been affected by the quaint and homely circumstances of his birth. He always claimed that he could walk at 2 and speak whole sentences at 4, and that was the only notable thing about him. The family later moved to Washington, D.C. after Charles Thurber took up a new clerkship job after losing his previous one. On a hot Sunday afternoon in their first Washington summer, James and his brothers were playing a version of William Tell in the backyard of the Maple Avenue house. 6-year-old Jamie and William both cavorted with homemade bows and blunt arrows, and Robert watched them take turns. When it was Jamie's turn to be the target, he stood up against the house. William took an awfully long time stringing his bow and arrow, and when Jamie turned to see what was going on, William shot, and the arrow hit Jamie directly in the left eye. Robert later recalled that Jamie didn't even cry out in pain. He didn't throw up, nothing. Mary, his mother, had no idea what to do, but the local doctor didn't recommend taking it out. Consequently, it was a long time before the blind eye was removed, and that was why the good eye went bad. For James, this was the first and most crucial trauma of a trauma-laden life. He ended up with sympathetic ophthalmia, an inflammation to the uninjured eye because of the transfer of poisons from the injured eye. By what he later deemed a miracle, he was able to see well enough out of that chronically afflicted right eye to read, write, and draw for another 40 years, and to see clouded images for almost 50. James attended Sullivan School, where he struggled due to his eye. Some of the teachers thought he was deaf due to his inattentiveness. At the age of 7, he became interested in drawing, with his first sketch being that of a tree. Unfortunately, his parents thought that William's copies were the originals, and praised him as the artist of the family. He ultimately came into his own at Douglas Junior High School, where he began to write and never wasted a word. Everything was used sooner or later. James was accepted into the most prestigious of Columbus's secondary schools, and was a studious and sometimes withdrawn type, a kind of loner, but he wrote more exceptionally than anyone else in his class. He was always drawing and then throwing the drawings away, as if he had no further use for them. It was James's family that made him so peculiar. His father was a sort of Walter Mitty, dreaming of what might have been. Influenced by Henry James and O. Henry, he wrote religiously, yet his first published story, The Third Bullet, held not the slightest clue of literary promise. He was, in all areas, a late starter. The family moved again to the house that was later fictionalized in Thurber's My Life in Hard Times. It was also in this house that Thurber's love for dogs became even more apparent. Dogs were later the primary subject of his drawings. Unambitious and insecure, James decided not to pursue an Ivy League education, but rather chose to enroll at the tuition-free Ohio State University. It was here that James discovered that he had a memory that could totally recall situations. This memory was crucial in his journalistic career and in his writing after blindness. His fantastic memory saved his life. Thurber was also a good and serious editor. As a reporter, he was passionate about accuracy. It was while at Ohio State that James learned both the ground rules for good writing and those for bad writing, and it is to his everlasting credit that he was also able to learn both lessons and make the careful distinctions. While at Ohio State, he also wrote for the college newspaper, The Sundial. It was for this newspaper that James first made illustrations to go with his writing, something that would later define and add distinction to his career. At 23 and a half years old, Thurber decided to quit college without a degree and become a code clerk for the U.S. government, encoding and decoding for the State Department. He was unable to do combat due to his eye and was rejected from all other non-combative jobs other than a clerical job as a code clerk that his father secured for him. Thurber became an expert in Greek code, and the characters in his book, The 13 Clocks, were named after green code ciphers, which fascinated him. As he matured, he began to study females as objects of inscrutable wonder, a study culminating in the creation of the Thurber woman. Thurber held a hopelessly impractical ideal of women modeled on the protected, mannered, and unworldly Victorian heroines of Henry James's novels, and his private defeats at the hands of women who fell short of this ideal gave birth to his art and prose. During this same time, Thurber became afflicted with Weltschmerz disease, or world weariness, as he came to believe that the physical reality could never satisfy the demands of his mind. This led him to write real original humor. Thurber had become the Thurber of his fairy tales and adult child fantasies. After a period of relative inactivity, Thurber began to work for the Dispatch as an editorial writer. It was at this job that he met Althea Adams. James had noticed her photograph in the yearbook and decided that he was going to marry her. He sought her out, and to everyone's utter amazement, they actually did get married. Unfortunately, Althea hated James's family and held them in contempt. Likewise, his mother disliked her from the start, and an amalgamation of the two of them became what was later known to the world as the Thurber woman. Althea became the forbidding woman in the famous Thurber cartoons and in his short stories. James was steadily growing tired of the Dispatch and wanted to leave, but was afraid to leave the steady employment. However, James's column was dropped, and his marriage started having problems. When Althea expressed her desire to go to New York, it provided Thurber with the necessary push to quit town. Unfortunately, James had little success in New York, and soon returned to Columbus, where the Dispatch refused to rehire him. Althea then convinced him to go to Paris, where he signed on with the Paris Tribune and began to sell short pieces back to New York papers. While at the Paris Tribune, the writers would fabricate or exaggerate parts of their stories, leading several to get fired. However, James was not, and in spite of the pranks, Thurber wrote some of his best news stories and tributes while in Paris. During their time in Paris, Althea became attracted to another man, and Thurber left her in Paris and returned to New York wifeless and penniless. He presented himself to a literary agency, which sent him to a struggling periodical called The New Yorker. The New Yorker rejected him almost instantly, crushing Thurber's spirits. He thought that they must have a rejection machine due to how fast he continued to get rejected. He kept writing and continued to get rejected and nearly gave up, but was at last offered a position on the Evening Post. Thurber did well in this position and won attention in journalistic circles. He began to write in shorter time frames at the insistence of Althea, who had returned to him, and the New Yorker finally bought one of his pieces. It was after this that Thurber met E.B. White, who introduced him to Harold Ross, the chief editor of The New Yorker, who hired him on the spot. Thurber was hired as an editor and said that it was holy hell. He began to intentionally make mistakes, at which point Ross gave him a vacation, and they became friends upon his return. Finally, Thurber was made a writer. He shared an office with E.B. White, and White influenced Thurber's style significantly. In fact, by a kind of gentle osmosis, White taught him to set down the clean, intelligent declarative sentence, which had generally eluded him up to their office sharing. Thurber was finally exhibiting an original talent. He began to write pieces based on his wife as they continued to grow further apart. His works mirrored the marital turmoil he saw between himself, a bumbling, put-upon husband, and his efficient, dominating wife. Eventually, they quite openly went their separate ways. In fact, Althea would invite other men over while James was home, and he would simply go upstairs. Thurber, in turn, had an affair with Anne Honeycutt, but she came in and out of his life with disrupting regularity. The separations from Althea became longer, and James felt less guilty about them. Also during this time, Thurber was struck with temporary blindness, a foreboding omen of what was to come. He made light of his own lack of sightedness, and, in fact, as one friend recalled, he had a glass eye and he used to change it at parties. He kept a series of artificial eyes in reserve for the prank, and as the evening wore on, Thurber's glass eye became more bloodshot, and at about 2 o'clock in the morning he'd put one in and it would be a little American flag. It was a shocker, you know. You'd look at him and there's a little American flag flying there in his eye. Thurber continued to write for The New Yorker and slowly began to distinguish himself. At one point, he covered a friend's memo pad entirely with dogs, and the extensive practice created a new breed, the Thurber dog. White saw the doodles everywhere, and they made him laugh. One day, White took one of the sketches he had laughed at and inked it and sent the drawing to the art meeting, where the editors were rather confused and thus rejected it. Meanwhile, White and Thurber realized that they were writing independent books on the same theme of being a spoof of the turgid psychological sex tomes that were being published. They decided to combine their effort into a book called Is Sex Necessary? And White had Thurber do the illustrations, which he completed in about an hour. Even though the publishers were confused, they printed it and it sold 50,000 copies the first year. These drawings were some of Thurber's most economical and funny. Ross soon requested more drawings from the now famous Thurber, and they were published in the newspapers. Many other artists were bitter that Thurber's drawings were published, but the stylistic elements, much like those that existed in his writing, made them unique and in demand, even though, as one of his friends commented, they looked like unbaked cookies. Most of Thurber's better drawings flowed directly onto paper from his subconscious. He rarely knew when he began a drawing exactly what would emerge. The ludicrous, sexless, nude woman he had meant to be crouching at the top of the stairs would find herself inexplicably atop a bookcase. A seal flopped on what Thurber had begun as a rock would end fantastically perched on the headboard of somebody's bed. To these bewildering situations he would append captions that startled and sometimes amused, but did absolutely nothing to explain. In fact, his drawings were so nonsensical that a psychiatrist once offered to cure him of his drawings, having decided that they came from a highly disturbed mind. Ultimately, Thurber declared himself the founder and sole member of the pre-intentionalist school of art. His drawings, as he put it, sometimes seemed to have reached completion by some other route than the common one of intent. He preferred not to practice because, as he said, "In the case of a man who cannot draw, but keeps on drawing anyways, practice pays in meager coin for what it takes away. It would have taken away even more but for the firm and impolite interference of Andy White, who came upon me one day 15 years ago, laboring over cross-hatching and other subtleties of draughtsmanship, beyond the reach of my fingers. 'Good God,' he said, 'don't do that. If you ever become good, you'd be mediocre.'" In 1931, his next work, The Owl in the Attic, was published, named after his drawing for the pet department, about an owl in the attic which ended up looking like a stuffed cockatoo. The series was extremely popular and was a satire of newspaper pet columns. Thurber also published a book of drawings that received high acclaim, with feckless, formless men and enormous, butch, voracious, manipulative, and dumb women. These became a consistent pattern throughout all of his work. In fact, his drawings were so good at conveying a clear message that E.B. White firmly believed that they were greater works of genius than his writings, even though Thurber got annoyed when his drawings received more attention than his prose. White said this, "I think Jim's was tops as a writer, but I also think his art surpasses his writing. I still think his drawing has the touch of genius. He underrated himself as an artist because he didn't realize he was a natural who didn't have to work at it. He usually drew while thinking of something else, and, despite his claims to the contrary, I don't think writing came that hard to him either. He used to rewrite a lot, but so does every good writer." Even after the birth of their daughter Rosemary, by 1931 his marriage to Althea was unsustainable. Thurber had become addicted to alcohol, and most of his wrath was taken out upon females he met, often to the detriment of his reputation. Althea finally had enough of their failed marriage and asked for a divorce. She received custody of Rosemary and monetary support in various ways. She filed in Connecticut for intolerable cruelty, which set the stage for a messy divorce, but was the only way to ensure that the difficult divorce could be obtained. The divorce was traumatic for him, and Althea regretted the nature of the hearings because she had to exaggerate his flaws while leaving out her own, which led to him looking like an awful person and failed to reflect the person he knew himself to be. During this time, he drew one of his most famous drawings, Home, which depicts a tiny cowering man approaching a large house that dissolves into a gigantic glowering woman. Thurber started going downhill as he drank more, wrote and drew less, and socially drew back. He was treated at Fritz Ford's sanitarium, admitting himself after hearing that O. Henry used it as a drying-out place, and was sober for a while, but after Anne Honeycutt announced her engagement to another man, he slid back. Of the women he cared for, there only remained Helen Wismer. He proposed and Helen agreed to marry him. They moved out to the country and James began writing profiles about celebrities who had fallen into obscurity. These works are some of Thurber's finest nonfiction prose. Around this time, Thurber's eyesight was also decreasing. He was seeing things that weren't there and was going blind. He would more than likely soon be unable to draw. He feared that he would soon depart from the supposedly enchanting world of the partly blind into what for him would be the terrifying realm of the sightless. He and Helen went to Europe and toured around making new friends before he could completely lose his sight. While in Europe, he saw Winston Churchill and Churchill's paintings, but he was unimpressed, saying, "The trouble with Mr. Churchill as an artist is that he is not insane and depraved enough, I guess." After his return to America, he wrote several fables that all had pithy morals at the end. In one that mirrors his ex-marriage with Althea, a pestering female chipmunk hectors her artistically inclined, less practical husband. When she insists that they exercise and go for a walk in the bright sunlight, they are both attacked and killed by a shrike. The moral: early to rise and early to bed makes a man healthy and wealthy and dead. In another on the rise of Nazism, Thurber describes how a pack of wolves descend on the rabbits for their own good, and imprisoned them in a dark cave for their own protection. The moral is, run, don't walk, to the nearest desert island. In a twist on Little Red Riding Hood, the supposedly innocent girl quickly realizes that even in a nightcap, a wolf does not look any more like your grandmother than the Metro-Goldwyn lion looks like Calvin Coolidge. Consequently, the little girl took an automatic out of her basket and shot the wolf dead. The moral was, it is not so easy to fool little girls nowadays as it used to be. One of the major themes of his writings is that the wisdom and bromides of the past no longer apply, and that life is unpredictable and full of unanticipated perils. In almost all of his fables, expectations are exploded, supposed truisms are twisted, and reality does battle with imagination and illusion. For Thurber, his hair beat the tortoise who had believed in the outcome of the old fable. In Thurber's words, a new broom may sweep clean, but never trust an old saw. One of his most famous fables, The Unicorn in the Garden, describes a typical Thurber husband who is entranced to discover a white unicorn with a golden horn quietly eating roses and lilies in his garden. However, when he alerts his wife, he is called crazy, and she calls the police and a psychiatrist, tells them to bring a straitjacket, and then, in an O. Henry-ish twist, which also became a Thurber trademark due to the fact that he had been inspired by O. Henry for years, she is the one bundled off to the psych ward after the husband blandly denies ever having seen a unicorn in the garden. The moral was not to count your boobies before they are hatched. And Thurber never revealed whether the unicorn was an illusion, actually existed, or was simply the man's ploy for disposing his wife. In this fable we see a core Thurber theme, which is that friction exists between husbands and wives in many marriages. His men are typically impractical dreamers, and his females are often hardcore realists and intensely practical. Many of his works focus on domestic unhappiness, similar to what he had experienced his entire life. Thurber is quoted as saying, "America is a matriarchy. It always has been. It always will be. It became obvious to me from the time I was a little boy that the American woman was in charge. I think it's one of the weaknesses of America. The mother dominates the son. He says, 'Hey mom, can I do this? Can I do that?' Permission from mom is the big thing. I don't think that there will be any revolt by the American man. In the series I did, The War Between Men and Women, the woman surrenders to the man, but you'll notice in the drawings that each woman has a big rock behind her back. In other words, the war is not over." Thurber did truly see men and women at war. The war of the imposing woman to maintain control and strict reality, and the war of the daydreaming man for imagination and freedom. On March 18, 1939, The New Yorker published the most durable and successful case for the daydreamer, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, a story that again employed the character trope of an impractical daydreaming man and a realistic and practical woman anchoring his external life. A 6-page story, the title character is a henpecked husband who daydreams more dramatic versions of himself, either as a military pilot, a star surgeon, or defendant in a murder trial. Just as Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle became an example of the type of people who fall asleep and let time pass them by, Walter Mitty became the example of those men who have been henpecked not only by their wives but by life. Mitty's world is one of escapism into his fantasies. His daydreams are works of art. Self-contained worlds with vivid detail and gripping dialogue. The alternate universe that Mitty constructs is every bit as real to him and to the reader as the blander one where Mitty keeps a physical address. Many of the invented technical terms that sound authentic and make the scenes feel so realistic are so effective because even though Mitty and Thurber lacked the experience to use jargon or terminology, the invented jargon like obstetriosis of the ductal tract sounds more authentic to a layman than malapropisms which could be accidentally recognized and thus ruin the illusion. Thurber seemed to say that imagination is what makes life resonate with meaning. In fact, the lack of imagination is something he saw as a flaw in Althea, and that is thus given to every female in his stories. Mitty is a key to understanding Thurber, whose fanciful mind allowed him to see a fabulous world in his modest Ohio childhood, and to transcend the grim hardships of his later years. Mitty demonstrates Thurber's skills as a parodist and his ability to use the conventions of commercial storytelling. Mitty's story had been present with Thurber ever since he wrote in high school about his daring exploits aboard the Seroplane. In Mitty, the fantasy just reached its peak in a masterpiece of brief, ironic comedy. Mitty continues to escape the mundane demands of his wife through his imagination. He quickly became the hero of everyone who inevitably yearned to be something other than what they were. Let's look for a minute at the first paragraph.
We're going through. The commander's voice was like thin ice breaking. He wore his full-dress uniform with the heavily braided white cap pulled down rakishly over one cold gray eye. We can't make it, sir. It's spoiling for a hurricane, if you ask me. I'm not asking you, Lieutenant Berg, said the commander. Throw on the power lights. Rev her up to 8,500. We're going through. The pounding of the cylinders increased. To-pocket-a, pocket-a, 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 pocket-a. The commander stared at the ice forming on the pilot window. He walked over and twisted a row of complicated dials. Switch on number 8 auxiliary, he shouted. Switch on number 8 auxiliary, repeated Lieutenant Berg. Full strength in number 3 turret, shouted the commander. Full strength in number 3 turret. The crew, bending to their various tasks in the huge, hurtling 8-engine Navy hydroplane, looked at each other and grinned. The old man'll get us through, they said to one another. The old man ain't afraid of hell.
Thurber created language that reads like a movie script, which manages to draw the reader in. This ability to change literary voices is also seen in other works of Thurber's, such as Is Sex Necessary and The Pet Department, where he models his tone off of journalistic exposés of the day. One example of this language imagery is found in the phrase "to-pocket-a pocket-a." This repetitive bit of onomatopoeia is a central example of imagery in The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. The sound produced by these letters instantly brings to mind the images of the various machines producing the sound in Mitty's imagination. The mechanical sound could be applied to almost any device or gadget that produces a repetitive effect. For Mitty, this ranges from a hydroplane to an operating room medical device to a flamethrower. The impact of Mitty was astounding from the moment it appeared in The New Yorker in March of 1939. Within a few years, Mitty's name and the sound he attributed to every complicated machine, to-pocket-a pocket-a, entered the language. In fact, during World War II, the phrase was used as a password in radio code, and pilots would identify themselves as Walter Mitty. In fact, the British medical magazine The Lancet formerly called extravagant daydreaming the Walter Mitty syndrome. The dream element seen in The Secret Life of Walter Mitty is one that is also seen in many other works by Thurber. Thurber, in both his art and his literature, asks the reader to consider how our minds are shaping our views of reality. This may have been the reason he was such a big fan of Henry James, a writer who otherwise seemed to have nothing in common with Thurber. While James's prose style is serpentine and ornate, Thurber's is gracefully simple, open, and declarative. However, they share a thread in that they employ psychological realism, where the characters are more than the developing plots, and most of the action is internal with thoughts and feelings rather than external. In spite of his success, Thurber suffered another bout of eye trouble, and decided that although blindness could soon be his lot, he should go through with the cataract surgery. Although initially successful, he soon needed a second surgery and became increasingly pessimistic about his ability to continue writing and drawing. In fact, however, he wrote more books after his blindness than before he lost his sight. The second surgery was not successful, and he resigned himself to a new method of writing. He was able to write by scrawling on paper and having Helen type it, and due to his incredible memory, he could do the composition and revisions of essays and stories entirely in his head. After a period of extremely dark and angry writings, he retreated into the world of childhood fantasy and began to write a simple fairy tale for children called Many Moons. After completing the work, he fell into a period of depression and demanded that he be taken to the home of some of his and Helen's friends. It took almost 5 years to mentally recover, and he still needed to see counselors and psychiatrists. He eventually recovered and took on more writings and found a method of drawing that allowed him to do 2 drawings a day by using a Zeiss loop, a head-mounted magnifier used in defense plans, and he found that he could see figures well enough to draw cartoons on 24-inch by 16-inch yellow paper with a black grease crayon under a bright light. For all of his continuing disparagement of his artistic abilities, he desperately wanted to draw again. With the loop, he was once again able to give the world his lumpy men, women, and dogs. Thurber also began to mentor other writers to help their careers and recruited writers for the New Yorker's staff. Next, inspired by L. Frank Baum's Oz books, he began work on The Great Quillow, which was meant to have a lot of nightmare and at least a little heartache. In the book, a Thurberish toymaker who is underestimated and mocked by his town uses his wits to destroy a brutal, grasping giant named Hunder. Quillow was described as a droll and gentle fellow who was amusing to look at and who could take his colleagues' jokes in good fun. He and the other craftsmen of the town are confronted by a giant who has made demands that are impossible to fulfill and would strip the town of all their resources in a few days. They have no idea how to destroy him, so while Quillow volunteers to be the teller of tales, the others agree to work on their parts of the demands even though they seem impossible. While all of the others start their momentous tasks, Quillow starts making little men that are entirely blue. The other craftsmen are angry that he did not help them, but Quillow is unconcerned. Quillow told the giant a story about a disease of the mind, which started with hearing the word Wadley for 15 minutes straight. The next day, Quillow told the giant a tale that had several long names, so that he could waste time until 6:45, at which point he only said the words Wadley, 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 as did every other person the giant spoke to. He then told the giant that as long as the chimneys were red and not black, he had no need to worry. Meanwhile, Quillow continued to make the blue men. The next morning, all of the chimneys had been painted black by the men of the town, and the giant fell for the trick. Quillow then told the giant that until he saw the blue men, he was fine, but, if he did, he would have to rush to the sea and bathe in the yellow waters in the middle of it. The next day, Quillow convinced the giant to stamp his foot hard on the ground to prove his strength, and when he did, the blue men Quillow had been making popped up from everywhere, and the giant rushed to the sea, where he ran into the middle and drowned. And at the end of it, Quillow went back to his life of making toys for the children that seemed almost magical. It is yet another example of Thurber's belief that imagination holds the greater power over realism, as the shopkeepers who try to follow the instructions to the letter would have failed, while Quillow, who uses his imagination to stall for time and create a plan, ends up saving the day. The Great Quillow is one of 5 fairy tales, including Many Moons, The White Deer, The 13 Clocks, and The Wonderful O, that are all really the same story, in which the man of imagination and love, a lightly disguised Thurber, solves the problems by outwitting both the tyrants and the kingdom's wisest men. It isn't the man of action that prevails, but the one who would appear to be weak, the minstrel in the 13 Clocks, and the toymaker and storyteller in the Great Quillow. The imaginative, weaker, impractical men found in Walter Mitty and in The Unicorn in the Garden also made their appearance in Thurber's fairy tales. A central theme to his work, his view of himself as weak but able to conquer through wit and imagination, is found in almost every story and drawing he produced. If blindness had cut Thurber off from competing in the physical world, he would have his private triumphs in fantasy. In all of his works, even though the men are weak and underestimated, ultimately they succeed and save the day. Thurber shows that imagination conquers reality because it has tools that reality could only dream of having. Although he might have slain giants in his books, illness proved a more persistent and formidable foe. Thurber almost died when his appendix burst and he contracted a bout of peritonitis, but he pulled through. Although his 40s were rough, as he said, he would go on as he always had, walking now a little more slowly, answering fewer letters, jumping at slighter sounds, but, he insisted, the best years were still ahead. Thurber seemed to come to terms, if not peace, with his near-total blindness, and decided to let well enough alone. He continued to draw using the Zeiss loop, large yellow paper, and black chalk, a specially lighted drawing board custom-made for him by General Electric, and a mechanical pencil from Czechoslovakia that made a line that glowed like neon, clinging to anything that would allow him to keep on drawing. In response to a woman that claimed that her son's drawings equaled his own, he said, "Your son can certainly draw as well as I can. The only trouble is he hasn't been through as much." Eventually he decided that the difficulty of drawing was too much, and in 1951 he scratched out his last drawing for Time magazine. Although he sometimes used his fingers to outline a Thurber dog in the air, and once did so with a flashlight to accommodate a photographer, who then used prolonged exposure to capture the fleeting image. Unnerved by the changing political climate after the Red Scare, Thurber fought against communism, saying that there is no trace of humor in communism, and that any political system that vehemently attacks humor reveals a great weakness, and that a thing that cannot endure laughter is not a good thing. Due to this climate, he found humor difficult to write. Finally, he retreated to the safety of fantasy and the past. While in Bermuda, he wrote The 13 Clocks, which centers on the theme that people need humor as well as love to survive. When the tale's heroic prince rides off in the end with his beloved princess, a well-meaning but inept wizard named Gollux advises them wistfully, "Remember laughter. You'll need it even in the blessed isles of ever after." The 13 Clocks is filled with poetry, puns, funny-sounding nonsense words, reverse limericks, and other word games. In fact, the names of the characters Gollux, Haga, Pavir, Ninud, Nadal, and Total all come from the creaky diplomatic code he had learned during World War I. A tale of a hero's quest, the cruel Duke in the 13 Clocks tries to kill time by stopping all 13 clocks in his castle. A handsome prince named Zorn, disguised as a minstrel, must accomplish a heroic task, the delivery of 1,000 rare gems to the Duke, in order to win the hand of the villain's niece, the fair princess, who is the only one who can use the warmth of her hand to restart the frozen clocks. Zorn obtains the jewels from a woman who weeps gems. While the jewels that come from the tears of sadness last forever, the jewels that come from laughter are fleeting and turn back to tears. Zorn obtains jewels of laughter, enough to win the princess, and the Duke is left with only a puddle to ponder before being slain by the mysterious monster, the Total. Just as language in The Secret Life of Walter Mitty was important to the visualization of the story, as it made Mitty's daydreams come to life, the very sound of words was becoming more important to Thurber artistically as it became more central to his own experience of reality. His use of assonance and alliteration helps convey the perilous journey of Zorn with special power. The brambles and thorns grew thick and thicker in a ticking thicket of bickering crickets. Farther along and stronger bonged the gongs of a throng of frogs, green and vivid on their lily pads. The pilgrims leaped over the bleating sheep, creeping knee-deep in a sleep stream, in which swift and slippery snakes slid and slithered silkily, whispering sinful secrets. Thurber had so much fun writing the 13 Clocks that he hated to hand it over to the publisher, and they ended up taking it from him in order to get it published. Thurber did not want meaning to be found in the 13 Clocks, a contrast from his other stories, and stated that the narrative comes first in a fairy tale, and that if you start out with a set philosophy in mind, the story is likely to become stilted or even pretentious. While in many of his other stories there was a moral or a purpose, Thurber wanted the 13 Clocks to be purposeless. Thurber next attempted to write a biography on Harold Ross after Ross's sudden death from cancer. He received help from several other writers and staff members at The New Yorker, but after the book was published, he received mixed reviews, as many thought that the book diminished Ross in order to elevate Thurber. Some said that there seemed to be a sense of envy in the book, and that more than likely Thurber both admired and envied Ross. Ultimately, Thurber didn't succeed at grasping Ross, and the Whites hated the book so much that their close friendship with Thurber essentially ended. Thurber wrote some of his greatest works towards the end of his life, but slowly his humor diminished and he lost his light and funny wit, similarly to Mark Twain in his later years, an author Thurber is often compared to. Mark Twain was the leading American humorist of the 19th century, just as Thurber is considered the leading humorist of the 20th. However, both men stopped being funny towards the end of their lives. In fact, many of Thurber's later pieces were rejected from The New Yorker because they lacked any humor. In his last years, he was irritable and angry and rude, but his friends mostly stuck by him. He then began bumping into things, wetting himself, and blacking out, but he refused to see a neurologist. While at the theater, he began to stumble, and upon arriving back at his hotel, fell and hit his head. He was then driven to the hospital, where it was discovered that he had suffered a hematoma and had a senescent brain. James Thurber died at 4:14 p.m. on November 2nd, 1961, due to respiratory failure, and true to what he had earlier predicted, Helen received a call while at the hairdresser's to come back. James Thurber was dying. Thurber's professional heritage is gathered into 30 books, most still available in frequent reprintings or readily accessible in any library. His work has been translated into many languages and appeared in many forms, as ballet, opera, radio drama, a half-dozen feature-length movies, short films, musical reviews, and a long-running television series. He is the namesake of the Thurber Award, one that honors innovation and outstanding contributions in humor writing. He was one of the most important founders of the New Yorker magazine, which even today continues to publish news, cartoons, satire, and humor. He also received honorary degrees from Kenyon College, Williams College, and Yale University, and was given a certificate of award from Ohio State University, from whom he also refused an honorary degree. Thurber was not religious, and he never allowed his probing, restless mind settle on any single theological insurance policy covering the possibilities of the hereafter. He was agnostic and is best described by what he stated was his belief. He said, "I don't see to see where anyone has figured it out, but sometimes it seems to me that time goes by like a flash of rain, and that's all we amount to in this world. There ought to be some point to it all, and I live in the hopes that the adventure of death is something equal to the adventure of life. It would seem strange to me if God made such a complicated world and such complicated people, and he had no more to offer than blankness at the end. So I live in the curiosity and the hope and the excitement of what there may be afterwards, and thus I have got myself to believe that those who pass on perhaps pass on to something as interesting, but lovelier and more happy than this life." Looking at strictly Thurber's works, it is obvious that he saw the world as deeply flawed, both in mankind's relationship to himself and to others. Thurber saw himself as insignificant and weak, and the relationships he described were filled with strife. His ultimate reality would most closely be that of his art, pre-intentionalism, which although he was the sole member in the art community, he is most certainly not in life. Thurber was pre-intentionalist in that he saw the world as chaotic and unplanned, a sort of random occurrence of events that was not ordered with intention, but was instead strewn about, and mankind was left to make the best of it. It is for this reason that imagination and creativity were so important. They were the only things that could provide a semblance of order. He saw other people and himself as a confusing combination of good and wicked, which was why he had such a hard time letting people leave, and why he himself never could decide how to treat the people he didn't like. He seemed to believe that the good in world was bestowed. He attributed his career to E.B. White and attributed his happiness to others as well. A proud and egotistical man, he was all too willing to accredit others with his success if they were his friends. Thurber seemed to think that man was on earth in order to do good. For example, Quillow saved his town, Zorn saved the princess, the husband saved himself from a bad marriage, and Mitty saved people in his daydreams. For Thurber, it was about the idea that by using wit, humor, imagination, and cunning, a person could save themselves and others and make life slightly better. Someone's meaning to history was small, but critical to those they saved. Thurber's world was chaotic, but his stories created the good he wanted to see in his own life. As E.B. White said, his mind was never at rest, and his pencil was connected to his mind by the best conductive tissue I've ever seen in action. The whole world knows what a funny man he was, but you had to sit next to him day after day to understand the extravagance of his clowning, the wildness and subtlety of his thinking, and the intensity of his interest in others and his sympathy for their dilemmas. Dilemmas he instantly enlarged, just as he enlarged and made immortal the strange going-ons in the Ohio home of his boyhood. He was blinded as a child and as a man by rage and sorrow, but his humorous stories and drawings have earned him a place in literary history that is entirely his own. So, while the Thurber man and woman continue to fight over reality and imagination, we will continue to laugh at seals on headboards and wives on bookshelves, at giants tricked by blue men and unicorns eating roses in the garden. We will continue to hear the tapakada of the whirring machine of Thurber's mind. So please, remember Thurber and remember laughter, for you'll need it even in the blessed isles of the ever after.